Life, Loss and Legacy is a general information podcast only. This does not constitute professional advice as we simply don't know your individual circumstances. If you do have any questions, please be sure to contact the guests of the episode. It should also be noted that the opinions expressed by the guests and host of the podcast are theirs alone and do not represent the opinions or perspectives of their employer or any other associations. That's enough warnings. Let's get started. Hello, and thank you for joining us again on Life, Loss and Legacy, the podcast from Planning Solo for people going through those first few years of bereavement. My name's Jordan Vaka. I'm an independent financial planner with Planning Solo, and I'm joined today by two very special guests to talk about a really big topic. We're joined today by Lauren Allingham from Vaka Property.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And also joined today by Adele Andrews of Australian Property Home Loans. Thanks for joining us, Adele.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Now, I'll quickly introduce the two of you and then we'll hop straight into our discussion today. So, Lauren is a buyer's advocate with Beckett Property. Lauren has a lot of experience working through the financial services area and has built her own real estate practice as well, helping people manage their investment properties all over Melbourne and, I assume, Victoria. Lauren now gets to work as a buyer's advocate, which means she works with individual clients by utilising her decade of real estate experience and a focus on data and analytics to help them buy a sound property that suits their needs, suits their purposes, and suits their budget. So, very excited to have Lauren joining us today. And Adele, we have from Australian Property Home Loans. She's a mortgage broker with a really strong passion for education and has featured in Studio 10, A Current Affair, 10 News, Forbes magazine, and has helped hundreds of clients refinance or buy a home. And one of the things I'm really excited about is Adele does a great amount of work in financial wellbeing sessions for individuals and for employers, and has built her New Beginnings program to help hundreds of women find financial independence and capability by following the step-by-step process that it offers. So again, to both of you, thank you for joining me on this podcast.
Thanks.
And we will keep going. So there's three main areas I'm going to pick your brains about today. The firstly is the fundamentals of actually buying a house. Who's who in the process, the different ways of finding and buying a house, and also bust a little bit of the jargon that I think we all hear when we're talking about these things. The second one is the emotional considerations of buying a house, which is a really big factor for our audience. And finally, the actual mechanics of buying a house. The people listening to this will not have bought a house on their own in the past, and there are some steps I'm sure they need to take. So, all of that very long-winded diatribe from me being said, let's hop straight in, and I'll start with you, Lauren, and just start asking who's who. Could you please walk me through where a buyer's advocate fits in the picture of somebody buying their home on their own?
Yeah, sure. So I'm often one of the first people that a buyer might engage in the process. Probably second, though. They might engage Adele first. If you're thinking about buying a property, your first question is probably, well, how much can I spend? So engaging with a mortgage broker such as Adele is the first point of contact, and Adele will help assess, their capacity to borrow, so long as they need to borrow, of course. And then I'm often the next person in the process, which is where I like to fit in. I like to help people at the top end of the process so that I can help guide them all along the way. And my role in that process is to help them articulate and understand what type of property they're looking for. So that is the dwelling itself, but it's also the location, and that we're going to have a conversation at that point about, their lifestyle goals, who they need to live nearby, is there some children or other family, schools, etc. So my starting point with a client is, really bedding down that part of the property scope before I then commence a search with them. So yeah, I kind of come in quite early.
Bit of a silly question. Who is your client in that arrangement?
Yeah, the buyer.
The buyer is the person they hire you directly.
They do. Yep, exactly. So I am, typically everyone is aware that in a real estate transaction, you've got the sales agent, who's the person engaged by the vendor who's selling the property. But I'm here batting for the buyer. So I'm competing against, in many cases, the real estate agent. I'm advocating for the buyer. Yeah.
I think you've preempted my sort of point there, because I think it's important we flag that the agent that you're dealing with is very nice to you and is saying all the right things. They're not working for you. They're working for the person selling the house.
Absolutely. They're trying to get the best result, and good on them for their client, that is the vendor. So they are not going to be open and transparent about the limitations of that property. They're not going to give you intel willingly, that's going to help you manage the price down. In fact, they're going to do the opposite. So having somebody on the buyer side, I'm super passionate about, because otherwise it can feel like a bit of a David and Goliath situation. I just try and even the playing field, by bringing all that information that I can to my buyer.
And that's definitely why I invited you on here today, because I think a lot of the people listening to this are confronting this on their own. You don't need to do it on your own. There are services out there that can help you. One of which is mortgage broking. So, Adele, could you walk me through a little bit, please, around kind of your truncated process for somebody buying a house on their own?
Yeah, so as Lauren said before, I typically come in I probably should come in first when it comes to the process, because it's all good and well to go out there shopping, but if you don't know what your budget is and you don't know what your borrowing capacity is, then it's a bit like throwing mud at a wall and hoping that it sticks. So from my perspective, it's important to educate not only on what your borrowing capacity is, but also what your repayments look like, because they're very often two very, very different things in terms of what the level of comfort is. So, I often have clients come to me saying, I want to borrow the maximum amount of money that I can. And then we go to the lender that offers that. But then when I tell them what their repayments look like, it's like, oh gosh, no, I don't want that. So it's a bit of a two-step process. So it's understanding how much money you can go out shopping with, understanding how that amount of money is going to impact your lifestyle in the form of repayments, and then understanding how there are features of a loan that can help you pay it down faster. There are repayment mechanisms that can help you repay it faster. It's very much an educational, hand-holding, consultative process.
And one thing that, I have a pretty firm opinion on, but some people still just go to their bank. They go to the bank they've always had. They go to the bank that maybe they're inherited via the estate. I don't understand why people wouldn't use a mortgage broker, because your service costs the person borrowing how much?
Zero.
So I don't know why you wouldn't use them.
I don't either. And to your point, I often have clients come to me say, I've gone to my bank, they've said this, they've said that, and it's often very one-dimensional advice. If you go to a bank, they're going to offer you their three products, their fixed, their variable, and whatever their package product is. Whereas if you go to a mortgage broker, they're going to take the time, or the right mortgage broker will take their time to listen to what your goals and objectives are. They will take the time to talk you through what options are out in the market. As I said before, they'll talk through differing borrowing capacities, they'll talk through expenses, budgets. It's a whole lot more holistic, and legally, we have to act in the client's best interests, right? The banks don't. They don't care. They just want to sell you the product, get you the money, or not get you the money, or the computer says no, which you often hear as well. They won't talk you through the whys or the how to get you there, or that whole educational process. Whereas a broker will listen, they'll consult with you, they'll hold your hand, they will talk through your options. It's very much up to the client in terms of the decision that's made and where it all lands. But it's a holistic offering that the banks can't and won't offer.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some old school thinking there, that people think there's some loyalty going to their bank, and being a bank customer, you'll get better treatment. But that is probably a bit of an outdated point of view, isn't it? You don't have a...
Yeah, and I think there's
there's no longer that relationship. Yeah. Yep.
I think a lot of people don't understand what brokers can actually bring to the table and what value add they can actually bring to the whole process. It's kind of like that safe option. Go to the bank. It's a brand I know. It's a brand I trust, as opposed to, someone who I don't even know who that is. And and I get that. I get that trust is a big part of everything, but it's certainly worth a try. And if you don't like the experience from the mortgage broker that you're using, then by all means go back to the bank. But unless you try it and you understand the breadth of options that you're going to get and the value add, it's, you know, you're just simply not going to know.
And I think that's especially the case if you've inherited perhaps interest in a business or interest in a trust or any sort of outside the norm kind of financial approach. The last place you would go is a bank. Go straight to a
and
broker.
they don't all handle that either. They don't all handle those sorts of structures. So it's, you know, important to go to that lender that's going to reflect your circumstances.
So speaking of...
Sometimes...
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say sometimes during the process for me, I need to contact my client's broker or banker, financier, at crazy hours, outside of business hours, on a Saturday. Saturday's the biggest day of transacting in real estate, and I can always contact a broker on a Saturday, a good broker. I can't always contact somebody's bank, and that can actually be critical in the buying process. So I just want to throw that in there too.
Yeah, I think availability is really key, and having that specialty, having specialists behind you during the process is really important as well. Which brings me, Lauren, to another specialist role that, I'll be honest, I'm not super familiar with. Where does an auctioneer fit in the process? Do you only see them on the day of the auction? Is there pre-work, post-work? How does that work?
Yeah, it just depends on the real estate agency themselves. Sometimes they have a particular person within that agency who does all their auctions or a bunch of their auctions, but often it is just the same person that you've seen at the open for inspections as well, the listing agent who's with that campaign right through to the end. So regardless of who the auctioneer is, you know, the engagement in that campaign from a buyer's perspective basically works the same in terms of understanding the information. Whoever's up there on the Saturday calling the auction, it shouldn't really impact, you know, that process from a buyer's perspective.
Occasionally from the outside, you kind of see them almost being pitched as this specialist and this fancy celebrity almost within the real estate side.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's not super important. Not to belittle them, like we won't completely...
Yeah, I mean, a great auctioneer can help elicit more bids at an auction for sure, no doubt about it. And if the listing agent doesn't feel like they've got that skill to get the best result for their vendor, then that's when they might have somebody else within their group do the auction. So I think they can add a lot of value. It just doesn't, from my side, it probably doesn't impact, you know, how I'm engaging in that campaign.
And again, they're not working for the buyer, they're working for the seller.
No.
So just re-emphasise that and keep that in mind. Adele, another person that people will engage with through the process of buying a house is a conveyancer. Can you please just walk us through where they fit in and what they can bring to the table?
Yeah, so I guess that comes back to what we're talking about initially, in that it's really important to have a team of experts behind you at all stages of the purchase process. So a conveyancer typically comes in when you have identified that property, you have a contract of sale and you need that contract reviewed. So it's looking for little things, anomalies that might be in the contract that you wouldn't typically pick up yourself. They have a knowledge about certain legal aspects that you might not have any awareness of. So it's like that finishing stage of ensuring that you're protected.
And we'll hop into a little bit more detail later on about the mechanics of the process, because I think when they're required, they're really, really required, and they have a really important role to play. Have I missed anybody through the process, from the decision of deciding you want a house to moving in? Who else have I missed in that in between?
Somebody else that we engage along the way that I'm always recommending a client would consider is a building and pest inspector. So as part of my process, I've got a pretty thorough checklist in the buying process myself, and I would always recommend you have an expert who is a qualified builder, check the structure, the safety, you know, all the different elements of the dwelling itself, and then they're also checking for pests, because there are things that, even I've been in property for 10 years and I've seen thousands of properties, but there are things that I don't know and I can't see that could be complete showstoppers, you know, in the buying process. So even if it looks nicely, newly renovated, they're going to check for things that we can't see, like waterproofing. Is there any rising damp? What are the stumps of the property like? They'll get a drone up, they'll have a look at the roof. So it is an investment of money. So I'll only recommend that to a client when we're pretty confident that we've got a good chance of buying the property. So we don't want to just spend that money willy-nilly. But if you're going to be spending hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, you want to know what you're buying.
Yeah, makes sense. Absolutely. Adele, is there anybody that pops into mind that we've missed?
I think they're probably the 4 key parties.
Yeah, I think it's funny. People get so nervous about such a big transaction, but then they take shortcuts when it comes to actually executing it, like missing on the inspection and not utilising a broker and advocate. Bit of a dissonance there. I think that doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me. But
the only thing that I would add to that is, again, it depends on if it's an owner-occupied or an investment purchase too. So if it's an investment purchase, I will often consult with the client's accountant, just so that we align on the way that everything's structured and ensure that it's maximised from a tax perspective and all that sort of thing.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a really good point. There's long-term and short-term considerations around that. We had another episode with Lucy Percy, an estate lawyer, and she mentioned that if you're buying a house, have a chat with your estate lawyer, like just a phone call one, to see if it should be owned in joint tenancy or tenants in common and that kind of thing. So I think the key takeaway is find the people you can speak with, have a team of people that you can ask silly questions of. I think that's a really important part.
Yeah, and nothing is a silly question, right?
Exactly.
And also, if you don't know all the people in the process, so long as you're engaging with at least one person who can then tell you who else you need to speak to. You know, once you've gone and borrowed hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, you want to consider your personal insurance protection as well. But there'll be people along the way who can tell you that. So long as you've got a couple of trusted advisors, you know, we can help you with the rest.
Absolutely. And to Adele's point that there's no silly questions, this actually might sound like one to most people. But I'm keen to know, how do people, this is so basic, but how do people find houses? Lauren, I'll pop that to you first.
Yeah. Most people find houses on realestate.com and domain.com, or sometimes a board pops up in your street and you think, oh yeah, that looks good. I mean, that is the way the majority of people, particularly without additional assistance from an advocate, would find real estate. They're on the apps, they're scrolling every day, becomes very habitual. Yeah, I find real estate that way as well. Of course, you know, that's a huge platform. But there are also additional ways of sourcing properties, and there is a huge market that transacts what we call off-market. So those listings never get to real estate and domain.com, and that occurs for many different reasons. And the way that you find those listings is through relationships with the sales agents.
So I think that's worth revisiting as well. So I mean, there's no legal obligation to list a property for sale on any of the apps,
No,
is there?
not at all. No.
So
Yeah.
knowing the right people and knowing who to speak with. Adele, when it comes to borrowing money, does it matter if the property was listed, or off market?
No. I mean, the only advantage is, I mean, at auction, obviously, there's no cooling off and it's unconditional straight away. But if it's bought privately, you can usually get your 3-day cooling off. But aside from nuances like that, makes no impact.
And I think one of the exceptions here that we won't cover in this podcast, if you do have questions around it, give Adele a call. But if you're looking to buy a property out of the estate, that's another way that sometimes maybe people have found a property. But that, again, has nuance, has specifics, so seek advice and definitely reach out to Adele. Lauren, I'm not sure they will necessarily require your services to
No, they won't call me then. They already know the property and they already know the price. Then they don't need me. Yeah.
So there is some jargon that I think comes with any big transaction, and we're all guilty of it. Definitely financial advice. We talk in acronyms all the time. So I just wanted to cover a few of the big jargon bits that I hear and run them by you, and again, see if there's any that I've missed. Adele, we've spoken about borrowing capacity. What does that actually mean for people?
So borrowing capacity means the amount of money that the bank will lend you based on your circumstances. So it takes into account things like your income, your expenses, any other liabilities that you might have, whether it be personal loans, car loans, credit cards are a big one. A lot of people fall over when I tell them that a credit card with a limit of $10,000 will impact their borrowing capacity by up to $50,000. It takes into account your credit score, all the things that assess your character, your capacity, all those sorts of things that come into money that calculates what your actual borrowing capacity is, or the maximum amount that the bank will lend you. And it varies from lender to lender, and it varies according to lenders' policies, and it can vary considerably, up to $150,000, even more in some instances, between lenders with the same set of circumstances of a client.
Which is another argument for speaking with a broker. Lauren, what is a Section 32?
I was just going to say, wait, we don't use any jargon. A Section 32 is the part of the contract of sale, also known as a vendor's statement. So it contains a lot of certificates that are pertinent to that particular property. If the property is part of an owner's corporation, it will contain the owner's corporation certificate. If there's been owner-builder work. So it's everything that the vendor is responsible for advising the potential purchaser about, and that is all contained within what we call a Section 32.
And that's a legally binding document provided through the agent?
Yeah, it is. So together with the contract of sale, Section 32 or vendor statement is provided as one holistic document generally, which has been prepared by the vendor's conveyancer, and that is then made available for review for any potential buyer.
Adele, I mean, when you've organised the money, I mean, your job isn't finished once the loan is approved. You're also involved in the settlement process. Can you walk me through what that looks like what settlement really is for people?
Yeah, and it's not just the settlement process, it's an ongoing relationship for many, many years afterwards. The reviews at 6 months, the reviews at a year, and looking at people's set of circumstances as they change and evolve and whatnot throughout the life of the loan. So it's not just a one-stop transaction, it's an ongoing relationship that goes for many, many years. But as far as the settlement process goes, I guess that's where we try and take the pain out of it all. That's where we deal with the lender directly. That's where we fight, kick and battle to make sure that everything happens on time, smoothly, stress-free, and again is an education process for the client. So talking them through, and it's done in consultation ideally with a conveyancer. So educating on what the funds to complete look like, and by that it means how much money you need to chip in towards the settlement as well as what the bank's going to throw in. It will take into account what your deposit will be. It will take into account stamp duty, bank charges, transfer duties, all those other numbers that come into play, which typically are addressed by myself when we're looking at before we even buy, so that everyone understands what the end is going to look like. So typically if someone comes to me and they want to know their borrowing capacity, we'll land on what the most comfortable borrowing capacity is, and that we would then go through, okay, if you purchase something at X, X and X, this is how much you're going to borrow, this is how much cash you need to contribute as well, this is what your stamp duty is going to look like, this is what your transfer fee is going to look like, so that when we get to settlement, the client's known that from day one. So there's no surprises, they've known exactly what they're up for, they know they have the money in the bank, and it's all comfortable for them. And then it's liaising with the bank, pushing for if there's finance clauses, which is the date that's stipulated in the contract that they have to settle by, making sure that the bank's on track to meet that clause.
A very nerve-wracking day normally. I can get pretty close to the line. So again, have somebody in your corner that can help with that. Lauren, you're working with somebody that found a house, you've decided you want to put in an offer. What makes an offer binding on the buyer, or what other considerations are there they should probably have in mind when they're making that offer?
It does depend on the information that you've been able to elicit from that process as to what levers you might be able to pull to make your offer most compelling. So no two negotiations or transactions are the same in that way. The price is obviously an obvious lever. The more money you pay, the more the vendor is likely to accept that. But understanding the vendor's circumstances and considering how your settlement period, meaning how many days after the contract is signed will they get their money at settlement, as Adele was just discussing. So understanding that lever is important. And it's not always that a short settlement is the best settlement for the vendor. Sometimes they need a long settlement because after they've sold this property, they actually need to buy something. Or maybe they're moving interstate or abroad and they actually need to stay in that home until a particular time. So whatever you can understand about that process and the levers that you can potentially consider outside of price might help you get the property for a good price as well. Ideally, putting in an unconditional offer where possible. So what that means is you can sign a contract or make an offer that is subject to something. Really commonly, it could be subject to finance or subject to a building and pest inspection. That offer presents risks to the vendor that they might not be prepared to accept. So as an example, subject to finance means they haven't necessarily gone to see an Adele before and they're not completely clear. And as Adele said at the outset, going shopping without knowing your budget and your parameters is not a good idea. Having the pre-approval where a bank has given you that confidence to go out and bid or offer up to a certain limit will allow you to make a offer that is not going to be subject to your finance approval. That's a huge one in terms of why buyers often miss out on bidding at auction or successfully negotiating a private sale or expression of interest. So we want to try and put forward the cleanest offer, if I can say that, with the terms that are going to be successful from the vendor's perspective and hopefully with the lowest price. What makes it binding, to answer that question, is actually only when a contract is fully signed. A verbal offer isn't worth a great deal. A written offer via email is a good first step, but ideally your offer is written into the contract of sale, which only needs the vendor to co-sign for that to be a done deal.
You mentioned settlement periods there. What are some common day counts of settlement periods?
Yeah, so typically vendors will be pretty flexible where they can because they don't want to limit their buyer pool by limiting the settlement options. So typically 30, 45 days, 60 days or 90 days is what we typically see.
The reason I wanted to cover that is I think it's good for people to know it's not just the standard 90 days or sometimes you might hear that from the impression might be, and I'm thinking of people walking to an open house on their own, they're having to elicit this information from the real estate agent. They're having to have done the work with Adele and make sure they've got their numbers in a row. It can be a lot to deal with, but just know that there is flexibility in most things.
Yeah.
Which does bring us around to the second area I wanted to cover with this huge transaction for people coming out of a bereavement process, buying your own home. What are some of the emotional considerations that come into play? Because we can talk about the mechanics of it all, but there's an emotional overlay that we're all very familiar with. So, Adele, what are some of the emotions you see from people buying a house on their own for the first time when they come to see you?
Yeah, and there are a lot of emotions, and I have dealt with a lot of people, particularly women, coming out of relationships, coming out of unfortunate circumstances, for the first time tackling or navigating this whole new world on their own. And a lot of it's anxiety, it's overwhelming. I think sometimes people feel a degree of shame or feel like they need to demonstrate that they know more than what they do, and they really don't. I mean, mortgages are complex, and many people don't understand them, and terminology does change, and it's one of those things that really only mortgage brokers understand, so it's perfectly fine not to understand it. But there is a lot of, look, depending on the circumstances, quite often there's a degree of sadness depending on the circumstances that they've come out of. So there can be a myriad of emotions, and it's really important to tackle something like this when your head is relatively clear and you are taking it all in. And that is one thing that I am very conscious of doing with clients that are coming out of those circumstances, just sort of slowing it all down, because it can all feel like it's happening too fast, taking it one step at a time, digesting one step at a time, and just getting to a point of feeling that, you're comfortable and you're okay to proceed. So it can be an incredibly overwhelming, anxious time if it is a new world to navigate. And I think it's important to work with someone who appreciates just how much that's going on in your world when you're tackling what's inevitably going to be the biggest expense that you're going to incur in the household. and that you feel comfortable with the direction that it's all taking.
When I came up with this sort of crazy idea around this podcast, the picture I had in mind was the people listening have seen their late partner's advisors, and they've either been condescended to, they've been really arrogant, they've kind of just patted on the head and say it'll be fine, or they've been really confused and not felt comfortable asking questions. So they're hopping in the car driving home and they're listening to something like this to explain all those elements. So I do want to revisit that point you've made, Adele, there, that you need an advisor that you can feel comfortable around as you navigate such a big transaction. If you do not feel comfortable with them, change advisors. And that applies to across the board. Like, you do not need to keep the same advisors in place. Adele, you mentioned a term there, shame, around the finances. It's something I see a lot in our advice side. Do you also, this is a bit of a leading question, but do you also see that shame kind of couples with fear of being taken advantage of as well?
I'm not sure if it's so much fear of taken advantage of. I think it's almost when something momentous happens and suddenly someone's feeling vulnerable about how little they know, they kind of beat themselves up a bit and think, I should have paid more attention to what was going on. I should have paid attention to what was going on with the mortgage. I should have paid attention to where the money was going. That's probably more the shame that I see, and it's pointless. What's been done has been done, but the most empowering thing is that now you can move forward, you can learn, you can build something new for yourself, and have this whole new world opened up for you. And the fact that you've gone through that experience now, you know, they're going to take more in, they're going to pay more attention, they're going to have more of an interest in what's going on going forward. I do see a lot of that, and I see a lot of women beating themselves up that, you know, with the whole, I should have been across this, I should have known this, and I don't understand this. And that's okay, because you know what? You and hundreds of not only women, men as well, who for whatever reason have relinquished control of the finances or decisions around the finances because the family unit has delegated different responsibilities to different members. Roles. Yeah. And quite often you don't see both parties looking after the finances. It's usually one or the other. Yeah. So that's probably more the shame or guilt, you know, that I see people beat themselves up over. Yeah,
I can see that. I think there's that question in personal finance that we keep pushing individual responsibility and ownership, but it ignores the reality of the system that we're all in. Lauren, you would have clients come to you when they are really overwhelmed, to Adele's point. How do you navigate that? Because the emotion comes in waves, right? So how do you navigate that during what's quite a stressful but exciting time?
Yeah, I do think maybe that's the one emotion that we haven't touched on yet, is that it can be a really exciting time as well. And we also need to make sure we don't get swept up in the excitement, and that we're making really sensible decisions that are aligned with our goals to begin with. There is a lot of overwhelm. There is an infinite number of properties that we could be looking at and buying, and which one is good. What I do with every client is, as I said at the outset, we start with a scope. What are we looking for? Why are we looking for that? What do you need in your life, in your lifestyle? And my job is to also overlay that expectation and that goal with what I know to be good real estate. So I'm always saying, well, this one suits your requirements, but it's really compromised for this reason or that reason. So I'm keeping clients on track, which I think can really help manage the emotions, because they know that they've got somebody there who's constantly anchoring them back to what it is, you know, we're there for. So I think that really can help manage, the emotions in that process. And it has the same effect to managing the excitement. I have clients who'll walk through a home and they just love it because it's got plantation shutters and beautiful engineered wooden floors, and I'm like, that's really good, and it's like a beautiful facade. The people who get swept up in a beautiful facade, I love a good facade as much as the next person. But hang on, it's in a really compromised location, or it doesn't even have that second living room that you said that's absolutely what you need. So we need to just regroup, anchor back to, you know, what we're looking for and why, and we keep going. There's no rush.
And I think listening to you both speak, it reminded me that our role often as professionals in the equation, we're there to help minimise the possibility of regret. Like, they
Oh,
could get
yeah.
swept up in buying that house because of the great facade or the great aspect, and then 6 months later realise the bedrooms are the wrong size or there's not enough living
Yeah.
areas.
Yeah.
And with mortgages, you go to the bank and you realise, well, you're overpaying for the next 30 years or it hasn't been properly accounted for. Professional advice, as much as my professional indemnity insurer would hate me saying that, is we are the opportunity for you to offload that and to avoid that regret with things like that.
I often say that I help people buy property, but my job is to tell them why not to buy the properties. Don't buy that one because of that. Don't buy that one because of that. I'm just always saying no so that we can find the yes.
Yeah, I think one of the other emotions that, just reflecting back on what we're talking about, you're saying excitement. The other one is empowerment. Once you come out of that whole new situation, you kind of overcome the overwhelm. You've gone through that sadness or whatever the experience is that's put you in this place now that you're now buying a home. When you've gone through that education program, when you've now found your house, when you settle and you've got this whole new life for yourself, there is nothing like it. And when calling those clients and saying you've settled is always an emotional one. Always. Not just them, for me as well, because you've been through this whole journey of despair to then, one step at a time, and now settling on a house and a new life. There is no feeling like it, and that new empowerment for them is pretty incredible.
This was one of the things. I mean, I started kind of along this journey of the business with divorce, as you guys know, and family law work, and now into this area. And I guess one of the things I had to learn was that all of these things have both sides of the emotional coin are in there. There's the negative, there's the sadness, the overwhelm, the stress, and there's the positive, the excitement and the empowerment. And I think they can be really mingled as well, because you can be sad on the day you settle your house because your former life is now finished completely, or you're moving out of the family home and downsizing. It's completely normal to have all of these emotions mixed in together.
Absolutely.
I just realised that I may be quoting Inside Out, the cartoon, where the balls, like they mix the colours as she gets older.
Great movie, yeah.
It's completely normal for your marbles to blend their colours.
That's funny.
So, with all of that being said, and I think with that awareness that you guys are bringing to that transaction or that process, what distinguishes a good advisor's approach to navigating that emotional piece to maybe a bad advisor's approach? And balancing that with getting to a destination, because we're getting engaged for a reason. Like, it's not just to sit around and hold hands; it is for a reason. How does a good advisor distinguish themselves from a bad one?
Yeah, I think it's in about personalizing the service. Like, if everybody who comes to see me has to fit into this box, this time frame, this process that I have, then I'm doing a disservice to that client. So it's about listening to the individual circumstances and then, adapting what I do and how I present my information along the way to that individual client, because I'm buying homes. I do work with investors too, but predominantly I deal with home buyers. This is going to be where they are going to spend every day, indefinitely. So I take that really seriously. And as much as I'm there to do a job and get them bought into that home, I have to do it in a way that they're empowered, they feel confident, they don't have any unanswered questions. So that's different for every client, because everyone's got a different experience to lead them to this point of talking to me. Some of them might have a lot of knowledge in different areas of real estate, and some might have none at all. So it's got to be personalised.
I think from my perspective, it's feeling heard, it's feeling understood, and it's feeling that that person's got your back, that you're not being sold to, you're not being talked at, that they haven't listened to some of the things that you've said, and that they get you. And as a result of that, you're kind of working at a pace that feels comfortable. You feel that you trust them. I think trust is a massive, massive thing. If you don't feel like you trust the person you're working with, well, then forget it, because it's too big a deal and it's too big a transaction, and it's too much of a life event to not feel that way. So I I think they're probably the key things, and feeling that, you know, the ethics and the values and the way that this person's going about their business is aligned to what you would expect from that experience.
Following on from that, I think I worded it really poorly, but the idea of we deal with emotional people going through a really hard time, but they need to make a decision ultimately. Lauren, with some of your engagements, do you have clients that maybe avoid making decisions or struggle with making that decision? And how do you tackle that? Because ultimately it's a very decisive gesture.
Yeah, sometimes if people don't engage me at the start of their process, Jordan, I know I've talked to you about this in the past, that sometimes people will come to me after they've been looking for a really long time and they're frustrated. And Adele's laughing because she sees that too. And sometimes the reason they haven't bought for such a long time is purely indecision. So I always say my job is to help people buy with confidence. If I've done my job properly, we've got to a point when we're about to make an offer or go into an auction where there are no more unanswered questions. And if there are unanswered questions, then my job isn't done. I haven't finished. So I haven't had a client where indecision has been a reoccurring thing because it is very methodical. I'm very data driven. The information is there. If we're not sure, well, then there's no decision to make. We've just got more questions to answer, if that makes sense.
I think a similar question for you, Adele, but I suspect there's a different urgency that can occur. If somebody comes to you and says, I've bought this house, now I need to get finance or something. Your role is part of your role is whittling down their available options to maybe one or two. Would you then give an explicit recommendation, or would you say which one of these do you think is more suitable?
So my job is to provide 3 options and also provide one recommendation based on what they've told me. But before I present that to them, I would reiterate, based on our conversations, this is what I believe your goals and objectives to be. This is what I believe you want from your lender and your loan product. And just make sure that, yep, okay, we agree. Then I would present 3 options that I think are aligned with those goals and objectives, as well as my recommendation as to why. Now, it's a recommendation. It's not an enforcement. It's this is what I think is right for you. But similar to what Lauren was saying, sometimes I'll get particularly if clients can't decide on whether they want a fixed or a variable rate. And they'll say to me, should I fix? What's the market going to do? And it's like, well, I don't know. And guess what? The lenders don't know and the economists don't know. And nobody knows without a crystal ball. But if you want security and you want surety as to what your repayments are going to be, and you don't care if rates come down over the next year or whatever, you just want to know you can make that repayment, then you go with a fixed. And there's other nuances that are associated with both fixed and variables. But I won't tell you what to do. I won't make that recommendation, and I won't say go this way, because I guarantee if it goes wrong in 12 months' time, you're coming for me. So it's just ensuring that everyone understands the pros and cons of each option and which outweighs the other and which feels better suited to what they're trying to achieve.
As you were describing that recognition of goals, objectives, context, building the understanding of the client, I'm like, there's no way you're getting that at a branch. There's no chance of going to a bank you're going to get that.
They don't care.
No, it's not their job to, yeah.
No.
I think the emotional piece, I think in this space, one thing I've recognised, and it's, again, why I've asked the two of you to join me, is you need to recognise that the people you're working with have an awareness of that emotional piece, and they're not uncomfortable by it. They're not trying to avoid it or rush out the door or just look away. So moving on from that, I'm keen to explore the actual mechanics for somebody who hasn't bought a house before, what the process actually looks like. So I'll start with you, Lauren. Somebody has maybe the estate's been settled, they've got the money there, they've decided they're moving, and they're looking for a different place. What are some of the mechanical steps people need to take from once they decide they actually do need to buy a house? And down the buyer's advocate path, we'll assume that they're engaging a professional to help them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's about understanding what it is that they want to buy and where they want to buy, which sounds really basic and straightforward, but it can be really complicated when you really start to think about what is it, how do I want to live in this home? How is it going to suit the way that I live? It's not just I need 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms and a lock-up garage. It's understanding the flow of the floor plan internally, how that flows with the outside space, if there is outside space. Like, what are the key things about the dwelling and how you like to live that you need to achieve? And that list can be really long for some people. So many clients will come to me and say, "Oh, I'm really fussy." I'm like, "Good. You're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. You should be fussy." And if somebody says to me, "Oh, Lauren, I just need like a freestanding house with this many bedrooms and bathrooms," I probe and I ask more questions. "Well, what do you need in the kitchen? Do you like to cook?" "Oh, yeah, I do like to cook." "Okay, so you need like a pretty established kitchen. What about in the bathroom? Do you need a bath?" "Oh, yes, I love to have a bath." "Oh, no, that's not important to us." Or, like, really think about the spaces and the things that you won't think about. Don't worry, I will. And then also the location, to be able to walk to a park because you've got a dog or you've got children, or how do you like to live? It's really not that simple of a question. So the more time you can spend thinking about that, or like I said, I will probe, don't worry, I'll get those answers. Knowing what you're looking for is the best starting point. And then what you'll find is that when you jump onto realestate.com or domain.com, most of the options don't suit anymore, because you can plug in your suburb and number of bedrooms and bathrooms and there's 350 options. But once you've got really, critical and really clear on those other aspects, you're no longer having to traipse through 12 properties every Saturday. There's maybe one or two, and that's okay because there's no rush, So that is the very beginning. Once you've found a match, and I don't know how much you want me to talk here, Jordan, I could go on. Once you've found that property match, the process from there, from my perspective, is very in-depth. It's about doing all the due diligence around the property, the zoning, all the things that we really need to know. But yeah, that's
leading into making the offer, I presume. So we will just take a sideways step there, if that's okay. And Adele, we've talked a bit about this, but arranging the financial side. So I've decided I need to buy a house. I've been through the exercise of being fussy, which is fantastic. We all want that. And I come to you and I say, okay, I need to borrow some money. What do I need to bring in to you, and what kind of decisions or clarity should I have when we first chat?
Yeah, so I think before you decide on your criticals, you need to know how much money you've got to spend. I'm just a big believer in that. Before you start shopping, just know how much you've got to spend, because you could end up incredibly disappointed when you've already eyeballed something that's your dream home, only to find that your budget doesn't go anywhere near that. So, and particularly in this market, it's a very tight market, and it's very, very important to understand just how much you have got to spend. Having said that, in order to calculate that, there are a number of things that need to be presented to me, and I do ask for everything upfront with all of my clients. It saves going through it again. It saves any back and forward between me and the lender. It means you just get everything to me once and we're done. So that includes things like pay slips. It'll include things like superannuation balances, income statements from MyGov, your ID, bank statements, credit card statements. I do credit reports. And, again, depending on your circumstances, it might also involve a HEX balance, car loan statements, just whatever is in your financial infrastructure, I need to know everything about. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to present everything to the lender, but I need to know everything so that I can circumnavigate what I need to in order to get the deal done for you. And it also means that the lender's not going to come back to me and say, well, hang on a minute, you missed this, and no, the deal doesn't service anymore. Or did you know that the client was this 6 months ago? Or did you? So I need to be across absolutely everything before we even go to a lender. And if there is any chance of this deal not getting through, we don't apply, and we wait until we're in a position to apply. I have got a 100% approval rating because of that. I will not submit until I know that this is going to be a deal. And if it's not a deal, I'll consult on why, and I will educate as to what you need to do and what we need to change or what we need to close and all that sort of thing. So there's it's quite a bit of paperwork, but I try and describe it that it'll be the most painful 30 minutes of the whole experience. So just bear with me, get me everything, and I will take the rest of the pain away from there.
And I mean, my questions are kind of presenting this as a really nice, tidy, sequential process, but it's not. There's a lot of back and forth. Like, it's not you do this and then you go to the next thing. It's you speak with Adele while you're speaking with Lauren, and then you speak with Adele again, and it's lots of mixing and mingling. There's two bits of jargon that came up there that popped into my mind that I know we all say. Adele, can you just address what's a pre-approval?
Yeah, so that was actually just one thing I was just reflecting on. So, a pre-approval, there are a number of pre-approvals available in the market. The only one you should have is one that's fully assessed. So that doesn't mean jumping on an online calculator and saying, I earn this and I've got this many credit cards, and the computer says, right, you can borrow $1.2 million. They are not worth the paper they're written on. In order to have a proper approval that is going to allow you to shop with some confidence, you need to go to a lender, and not every lender offers these. Only a handful of lenders will offer a fully assessed pre-approval, which means they have assessed your circumstances as though you've actually got a contract and you have bought. So they will look at the way that your income has been presented. They will look at your background information, your bank statements. They'll look at everything and say, okay, we have assessed absolutely everything about this client's circumstances. This is their borrowing capacity. The only thing we now need is to value the property that they've bought. So what I say, it's a fully assessed pre-approval subject only to the valuation of the property that they've purchased. Now, that valuation is usually 9 times out of 10 the value of the contract or the purchase price that you've purchased it for. Having said that, I have, very rarely, but I have seen valuations come in under the purchase price of the contract. So it is something to be aware of. It's never a bulletproof process, but it's as close as you're going to get, and it's the only process that you can get to without that. You can't control the valuation. That's going to happen regardless. So that's completely out of your hands. But as long as you have covered off every single other piece of the process, then that's as good as you're going to get to a pre-approval.
And how long are they valid for generally?
Usually 90 days. I have got one lender that will go to 120 days, but usually 90 days.
And there's a downside to using pre-approvals too frequently, isn't there? It's not necessarily a downside, but as I do say to all my clients, we're only doing this if you're serious about buying over the next 90 days, because it's not something that we keep going back to the well about, because every time we hit for a pre-approval, it hits your credit score. So it's points off your credit score, which in turn, if you don't buy within that 90 days and then you hit another one with 90 days, if you're going back for a third, your score might be compromised to be able to do that. So unless you are serious and you really, really are focused on buying in those 90 days, I wouldn't encourage anyone to go for a fully assessed pre-approval. And that's why I wanted to flag that, because through other people that we work with, you hear about brokers that are putting in, normally new brokers, 2, 3, 4 pre-approvals, and it just blows the credit score apart, and it's not a very good outcome. Laura, we'll chop back into what you were saying earlier, that you do the work to get ready to make an offer. So could we walk through those mechanics just again, please?
Yeah, so the work between finding the property that we like and making it an offer is the most significant part of my job. I refer to the whole thing as my due diligence. So part of that is having the contract and vendor statement reviewed by a conveyancer and understanding what it is they've come back with. Part of that is having the building and pest inspection done. But there is also a number of other things. So it's about critically assessing the property. We use a 44-point grading system internally, where I'm looking at every element of the dwelling, the land and the location, and grading that against real estate broadly to make sure that what we're buying is high quality real estate. So we're challenging any potential compromises and making sure that we either understand them and we're happy to move forward, or perhaps we're walking away. We do council checks. So we need to know the zone in which the property sits. We need to know the zone in which our neighbours sit, and what that means in terms of if and when the property next door is developed, what can they build? How high can they go? And will that impact me and my enjoyment of living in the property or driving down that street? So I'm doing all of that work for my clients. I'm sort of the quarterback Also, I hear, I don't really know what that does, but they are, I don't know that's called. Um, but I'm bringing in all this information and presenting it to the client. This is way before we're making the offer. So we've answered all of our questions.
Who
Yeah.
does that work for somebody who doesn't have an advocate?
Well, the buyer would do it themselves. And I think some buyers are aware of certain bits that they should do. And the thing is, you don't have to do it. You can just see a property and make an offer on the same day if you want. However, not understanding all the possible risks and assessing to make sure you're comfortable with them is where people can come undone with property purchases. And that's where there can be some additional costs or regret, down the track that could have maybe been mitigated had more questions been asked.
Yeah. I think that, again, regret avoidance, I know for me it's a big thing. I don't like regret. So you've chosen the house, you've put in the offer, which was kind of covered, you put in a subject or conditional offer, and then it's accepted. What happens then?
Hooray! We celebrate. We put up the sold sticker, and that's a really fun moment. I joke, but it's a really nice time to pause because it is a really exciting time.
Sorry, who puts up that sticker, the vendor or the buyer?
The buyer, always. I'm always saying, if it's a private sale, I'm saying, don't you put up the sticker. That's what my client's doing because we need to enjoy that moment. We often have to pay the deposit immediately. Typically, the deposit of the purchase price is 10%, although that is a negotiating factor. I just bought one last week at 5% deposit because my client was waiting on some funds from property she had sold. But typically you're paying the 10%. It takes a bit of the excitement out of it when you've just got to go and transfer tens of thousands of dollars, but we've bought a property, so be it. So yeah, we're paying the deposit.
And where does that money get paid into? Sorry, Lauren. Does that get paid to the vendor directly?
No, it goes into this estate agent's trust account and is held there until settlement. It doesn't get released. I mean, there are circumstances where it can, but typically it's not released until settlement. But it's out of the buyer's bank account. And then what I do is I introduce all parties in the transaction. So I would introduce Adele to the client's conveyancer, so that and also include the sales agent, so that the professionals that you've engaged around you are now, they can kind of take that process and run with it to settlement.
And settlement is when we spoke a little bit, Adele, about this pointy end of things. So property's sold. Settlement is set for a time and day, isn't it? Like 12 p.m. on the 1st?
Yes, yeah. Very rarely meets that exact time. But that's okay. That's for me to manage, not the client. But yes, it's scheduled for, I say a day. I think sometimes the time is often hard to stick to and it creates more anxiety than it needs to. So it's important to have that conversation up front. Look, sometimes you get lucky and it happens early or, happens on time, but more often than not it can get pushed out by an hour or so but yeah, usually a day.
But it's very common it would happen that day unless something's gone wrong.
100%, yes.
So contracts are exchanged, the respective conveyancers check them off and make sure they're okay. Give the okay to the buyer and the vendor. It's all signed, it's all agreed, settlement hits. Now, the deposit's been paid, that's in the trust account. Where does the money from the loan that you've arranged, Adele, where does that then go?
So that typically all goes through an online system, PEXA, and it's all handled usually by the conveyancer. So the conveyancer and the lender they talk about what needs to be put into that particular system. So that will include things like your stamp duty, your transfer costs, all those different components that I spoke about before. That all gets uploaded into that settlement system, or it can be held in the buyer's bank account, or it could be in the conveyancer's trust account, but all gets exchanged through PEXA and all settles through that account.
And then at 12:01 on the settlement day, the money is then released to the vendor and the buyer, the title goes to the buyer or the lender. When does the buyer get the keys?
Pretty much straight after, when they chase the person down to get them.
Yeah, so we will, the sales agent who sold the property is holding all the keys for the property at that point, all copies of the keys, and they will release the keys to me or to the buyer directly once they've had confirmation from the vendor's conveyancer that everything's gone through. The buyer's conveyancer, it's not good enough. They need to hear it from the vendor to say we've got the money, which is typically within half an hour of the transaction settling. So it's just a quick email, or I'll give the agent a buzz and say, just confirming you're cool, settlement's happened, and off the client goes to pick up the keys and walk into their new home.
So a very exciting day. I have witnessed the stress that advocates and brokers and clients can go through on the day of settlement. It is completely normal. You have people helping you for a reason. Try to enjoy the day as much as you can.
And it's not always stressful.
No.
I mean, it's more often than not, it's an exciting day. So, I guess it depends on the way you tackle it.
How many nightmare scenarios did you just think of as you were saying, and all the ones that have happened? So a few quick-ish questions. Lauren, would you typically see clients move in that day? Would they allow a bit of time to get the place cleaned or painted or anything like that?
Yeah, it just really depends. And it is I'm glad you mentioned the cleaning, because sometimes the expectation, especially if the buyer has always been a renter, the expectation of how the property is going to be presented might not be met. A vendor, there's nothing in a contract of sale that says they have to have the gardens done, they have to have the property professionally cleaned. So allowing a little bit of time to walk in and get a sense of how it is not a bad idea. Most buyers, and we do have an opportunity, I'll just add, in every transaction, legally, a buyer has the right to inspect the property prior to settlement one time, typically within that week. It's called a final inspection, and it's an opportunity to walk through and see the property again, because you might not have seen it for 30, 60, 90 days since the date of sale. So we're looking at the property there, and we're getting a bit of a sense of how it's likely to be handed over as well. Most of my clients are sort of moving in pretty promptly, unless there is obvious work that needs to be done, like you said, painting or updating. But yeah, typically people are just moving in that weekend.
And between when the offer is accepted and final settlement, who's responsible for any damage in between, if that's not opening too big a Pandora's box?
Yeah, it is. That's a whole nother story. But basically, the property needs to be handed over as it was inspected, as it was, on the date of sale, minus any fair wear and tear. The term fair wear and tear is subjective, and that's why we're opening Pandora's box. But there is not just depending on the individual contract, there's not necessarily a necessity for everything to be in perfect working order. So it's a buyer beware contract, and that's really important. That's why we check everything as best as we can before we're making an offer and signing a contract, because you're buying it in that condition.
Yeah, I think that's really important to be aware of, that buyer beware aspect. Adele, my final, perhaps curly question goes to you. Occasionally we have clients that say to us, I don't know to buy, like, what's the order of operations? Do I sell first, buy first? I know what I'll do. I'll do it both and settle on the same day. Is that something you would recommend?
Recommend is a strong word. And it's actually not a decision for me to make. What I will say is that I very rarely see it go wrong with a simultaneous settlement. The systems and the processes now are advanced enough for things like that to occur relatively seamlessly. However, that is probably a situation where it would be a stressful experience. There's a lot riding on a simultaneous settlement. So, and look, sometimes it's unavoidable, right? Rather than getting bridging finance, and if the timing works, it's often the most sensible way to leave your current property and move into the next one. So, it can sometimes be unavoidable, but it's not always a stressless experience. But as I said, I rarely see it go wrong.
That's
and it's one of those things that in some circumstances is unavoidable, because you might not have somewhere to go if you settle first and then wait for the other one to settle, or there's so many situations and circumstances that prevent avoiding the simultaneous settlement.
I think if nothing else, it'll be a day you'll remember for a long time. It'll be one of the days of your lives that you'll remember for a very long time.
Yes.
We'll bring things to a close there, because I think we've covered so much ground. I think there's so much useful stuff there. And I almost think the temptation for some people listening might be, they've told me everything, I could do it myself. And all I can think of is good luck to you, because there's so much ground that we haven't even touched on, I think, in the background of this. So, Adele, do you have any final comments or points you'd like to make before we wrap up?
No, I think, for anyone that's embarking on a journey like this, and we've referred to it throughout the program, it's very important to have experienced professionals in your corner that are dedicated to their own craft. So there's not one person that does it all. Align yourself with varying professionals that are experts in their own craft, and they can advise you on what's in their wheelhouse. It's the only way that you're going to avoid mistakes. It's the only way that I think you're going to have faith in the process, and it's going to take time, and it's going to take stress and all those things that people don't have the luxury of. Just engage people that you feel comfortable with, that are going to take all that off your hands when you're already potentially going through enough as it is. Just leave the dirty work to those that are used to it and can take that off your plate.
Completely echo that. I think I've recorded a few of these now, and the echoing message through all of them is just engage the specialist. Don't do it yourself. It is not worth the hassle or the stress. Lauren, any final things you'd like to put out there as well?
Yeah, I suppose specifically on the buyer advocate side, but not exclusively, a lot of people think a buyer advocate is only if you've got millions and millions of dollars to spend for high net worth clients. That is not the case. So don't feel like for any of these services that we've talked about today that you are not worthy or you're not a potential customer of this service. I personally work with clients with any budget and any scope. So don't feel like you can't at least ask the question, am I somebody that you'd work with, and get that advice.
Yeah, I think that's really critical. Just ask the question, find out. There are people out there that will help you through what is a really, really full-on process. Adele, if people have more questions or they wanted to reach out to you, where's the best place to reach you?
Adele at aphl.com.au, or my website, australianpropertyhomeloans.com.
Perfect. Lauren, if they wanted to reach out to you?
Yep, I'm Lauren at beckettproperty.com.au, or you can follow me on Instagram, lauren.allingham, and you'll find me under the same name, surprisingly, on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. We will wrap it up there. Thank you again to both of you. Thank you so much for sharing so openly about this very big process and transaction in somebody's life, and to your point, Adele, the journey that they're walking through. My name is Jordan Vaka. This has been Life, Loss and Legacy, the podcast from Planning Solo for people going through bereavement. If you do have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at jordan@planningsolo.com.au. Otherwise, we will see you at our next episode. Thanks very much.